Happy Sunday, everyone. Greetings from the Delta Sky Club on my way to Memphis, Tennessee for the week. Wanted to share some quick thoughts on a recent news development that the church announced, specifically the First Presidency, and that is the termination of the temple cornerstone ceremony. This is a very short press release. I don't think most people saw it, didn't get a ton of attention from what I saw, but I think it's a significant decision that's worth talking about and using it as a reference point to see if other or similar or parallel things have been happening in the modern church where we are moving away from rituals in favor of possibly efficiency or corporate structure or whatever, right? Different angles here. So first I want to talk a little bit about cornerstones, because in order to understand why the decision was made to get rid of the cornerstones, we have to understand how the church has referenced and ceremonialized, if that's a word, the cornerstone process of the temple. And to do that, let's talk more briefly or more broadly about the general history of cornerstones. So historically, the cornerstone was the first stone that was set during the building process. You know, they would carefully measure the stone. They would try and make sure it's exact, the angles were right, because it was from that stone that all other stones in the edifice, especially the foundation, would be organized and would be aligned. And cornerstones have been around for millennia. Ancient cultures had all kinds of rituals around this. In ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamia, they had kind of what we might call a groundbreaking ceremony. It was the foundation ritual, and that would allow the gods to protect the building. So it was this kind of dedicatory type of ceremony around the laying of the cornerstone at the beginning of the process. Buildings were often designed in relation to constellations and stars, astronomical points on the compass. Ancient cultures would often believe that how you position these buildings in relation to these heavenly bodies would dictate, success or prosperity or whatever. And so oftentimes cornerstones were placed facing the northeast because they thought that this location would bring prosperity to the building and its owners. So that became part of the kind of tradition and ritual, this kind of connection of the building to the cosmos and reaching for the heavens, if you will. Oftentimes throughout history, they would do what were called foundation deposits. So in the cornerstone, they would hollow it out, and they would put in various things, what we might call today like a time capsule, little mementos, symbolic items, animal deposits. That they would often do this with temples and tombs and palaces and forts, and they would often do it in the corner of the building, and they did this in part to ensure that the remains of the original building's content were preserved with the building throughout its life until later demolition. Of course, a lot of this cornerstone ceremony then gets wrapped up in masonry. I'm not going to get heavy into masonry here. I'm planning at some point to do a musing just about masonry and Mormonism. But suffice it to say for now that, masonry, where it kind of evolved out of stone masonry and the actual masons who were involved in this whole process of creating these buildings, they were very particular in their ceremonies around the cornerstone. The earliest record of a Masonic ceremony is the laying of the foundation stone at a royal infirmary in Edinburgh, Scotland. So this is the Scottish Masons in 1738. So that's the earliest instance on record where the Masons are doing a cornerstone type ceremony. Benjamin Franklin, who was a Mason, while he was the Grand Master of Pennsylvania, he established the tradition in America, beginning with the cornerstone laying of the State House in Philadelphia. George Washington later did it for the nation's Capitol building. He was a Mason as well. And from the Mason perspective, Masonic perspective, the cornerstone symbolizes sturdiness, morality, and truth. So I'm going to read a little portion of a description from a Masonic website talking about their perspective on the cornerstone. It says, at his first initiation, the Mason is tasked with erecting a spiritual temple in his heart, drawing symbolic parallels to the strong, trusty cornerstone, without which a building, symbolically the Mason's mind and heart, cannot stand. In ceremony, the entered apprentice is typically placed in the northeast corner of the lodge as a figurative cornerstone. This signifies the unity of the north, darkness, and the east, light. The initiate learns and understands the necessity of integrity, stability of conduct, of truthfulness and uprightness of character, and of purity and holiness of life. He is also charged with maintaining all these virtues. And then it concludes, these characteristics are all associated with the strength and durability of the physical cornerstone. It is customary for Masons to lay the cornerstones of public buildings through ceremony, traditionally with the stone placed in the northeast corner of the foundation. So a lot of Masonic influence here, but ancient cultures were all doing this too. This is certainly not just a Masonic thing necessarily. Of course, throughout the scriptures, we see not only references to, but symbolism around the cornerstone. So in New Testament times, for example, in multiple references, it talks about, in reference to Jesus, it says that the stone that the builders refused has become the head stone of the corner. So they're saying the people rejected Jesus, and that rejected stone, the rock of our Redeemer, that stone is now the cornerstone. The stone that the builders, so-called builders, cast aside and said, oh, no, we're not doing that one. That's now officially the cornerstone from which every other stone has to be oriented. It talks about how in the Book of Mormon and Jacob, how the Jews rejected the cornerstone. So again, lots of comparisons to Jesus as the cornerstone. They, in New Testament times, thousands of years ago, and in the Old Testament, there's references to this. They were, of course, literate in this symbology and this ceremony around the cornerstone because it was a large part of their societal kind of practice of constructing buildings. The cornerstone has a purpose. It's very important, has to be precise. And so this has biblical mentions as well. All right, now let's go to modern church history so that we can then kind of put this in context for what it means for us Mormons. So church is formalized in 1830. 1 year later in independence, 8 elders gathered together, including Joseph and some of the other early leaders, Sidney Rigdon, and there they dedicated the land for the eventual gathering of Israel in independence, and Joseph laid a stone at the northeast corner. Interestingly enough, the government owned the land at the time, so the saints were trying to claim the land so that as they, with Western expansion, it was often, not squatters, I guess, but the first people to claim a property kind of got default rights to either receive it or buy it. And so Joseph was trying to stake a claim on this government-controlled land so that once it became available for sale, the church could get it. It went for sale to someone else, and then the church early on bought it from this other couple. A few dozen acres, I think. So interestingly, this is now what's called the temple lot. In fact, there's a church, so they're called the Church of Christ. Informally, they're called the Hendrickites, or they also go by the Church of Christ, parentheses, temple lot. And so this is kind of a restorationist branch of the church, you might say, one of the post-Joseph Smith breakoffs from the Brighamites that went west. And in the Church of Christ temple lot, they own that parcel. They reject the office of prophet and president. They're led by the Quorum of the 12, or a Quorum of the 12. They reject the Doctrine and Covenants. They reject the Pearl of Great Price. They reject baptism of the dead. They reject eternal marriage. Very, very interesting. So They've got about 7,000 members, mostly in the States, but in some other countries as well. So very tiny, but that's where it all got started, is in Independence, Missouri, in 1831. 2 years later, they're in Kirtland. And there was a revelation commanding the saints to, quote, commence a work of laying out and preparing a beginning and foundation of the city of the stake of Zion here in the land of Kirtland, beginning at my house. So shortly after that revelation, there's a cornerstone ceremony held. The first presidency is there. There's not much history about this. There's, as far as I could tell, and what other scholars were saying about it, there's like no official record preserved. There's some journal entries from people who were there, but they didn't really talk about the ceremony. They were talking about their own kind of just experience. And so there were 24 elders. We don't have record apparently of, what order they laid the foundation and who and so forth. Here's a Kirtland historian I'm going to quote from. He says, "We know little of the laying of the Kirtland Temple's cornerstones. We do know that 24 priesthood holders met on the temple site July 23rd, 1833, to lay stones from the quarry. The first presidency and 3 others laid the southeast cornerstone. 6 additional priesthood holders stood at and laid each of the remaining 3 cornerstones. According to what George A. Smith," so I guess that's George Albert Smith's dad, I would assume, "according to what George A. Smith called the order of the holy priesthood. We can assume the stones were laid in a particular sequence, but we have no documentation as to the order of that sequence." Interestingly, the Independence Temple, the stone that Joseph laid was in the northeast corner, just like all of these ancient traditions and the Masons and everything focusing on the northeast. Here, according to the limited records we have, Joseph and the first presidency are doing and beginning with the southeast corner. Maybe interesting, maybe relevant, I don't know, curious. Okay, 6 years later, we're in Far West. Wilford Woodruff later talking about this instance, he says that the 12 apostles were called by revelation to go to Far West, Caldwell County, to lay the foundation of the cornerstone of the temple. That's in D&C 118, verse 5. Those cornerstones, by the way, are still visible today. When you go to Far West, you can see those cornerstones. So there's another early ceremony. 2 years later, 1841, in section 124 of the Doctrine and Covenants, Jesus Christ refers to Nauvoo as the cornerstone of Zion. 4 times in this revelation, he calls Nauvoo the cornerstone. So a few months later, in April, we're in 1841. The saints are now in Nauvoo, and after all these fits and starts with past temple attempts, and Kirtland was, successful, here they are in Nauvoo, and they set to building another temple. So at the General Conference in April of 1841, the southeast cornerstone was set in place under the direction of and dedicated by Joseph Smith, representing the first presidency. Thereafter, the other cornerstones were ceremonially placed under the direction of various priesthood leaders, as designated by the prophet Joseph Smith. The account records that the Nauvoo Legion was present to add an air of ceremonial splendor to the occasion. Interestingly about this, I'm going to get into a moment of like how much of this had changed in modern times. But when President Hinckley decided to rebuild the Nauvoo temple, because if you don't know, right, the original temple was destroyed. There was a fire, there was a tornado, everything go boom. So it was, 15, 20, 30 years ago, whenever that was, that the Nauvoo temple was rebuilt. And when President Hinckley was kind of crafting deciding what to do, he decided to recreate this exact pattern of the cornerstone ceremony with the different priesthood offices at each cornerstone in the same order. I find that kind of curious that despite not doing that for any of these other temples, they were trying to harken back after the old order of how things were done and do it the same for Nauvoo. So just an interesting little tidbit. Of course, a decade later in Salt Lake City, April 6th, 1853, Brigham Young lays the cornerstone of that temple. And so the early saints were very, many of the early saints were all Masons. So again, we'll get into the Masonic influence of Mormonism later. But there was definitely this recognition of an importance placed upon the cornerstone ceremony, placing the actual cornerstones. Now, in modern times, they moved away from a cornerstone ceremony. They had a dedication ceremony, right? And yay, we are pretending to shovel dirt with gold shovels for a photo op and turn it over and, that type of thing. So there's still this kind of modern dedication ceremony for the land. However, the cornerstone ceremony in modern times was modified at some point. I couldn't really find quite when. But it goes back a ways where, as you're probably familiar with, the cornerstone ceremonies were after the dedication of the temple. The first presidency or whoever's there would come out of the temple. They're dressed in white. There's a stone, that says dedicated, 2023 or whatever the year is. And they didn't put in all of the, the mortar. And so the job to put the final tiny little piece of mortar in between that large stone, which isn't actually the cornerstone and it's not the foundation, because now with modern construction standards, there's foundations are just done differently or whatever, with, reinforced concrete and all that kind of stuff. And so they're more like symbolic cornerstones, which is fine, right? And oftentimes there's time capsules as well, kind of like in ancient times. But the ceremony had been changed so that it was this post-dedication little photo op outside. Oftentimes the leaders of the church, again, dressed in white, would invite a couple kids, and they would have a little, I'm not a handy guy, I don't know what the little mortar tool is, but, they'd fill it in, and they'd put the remaining bit of mortar, and they'd take a photo, and, yay, now we have a cornerstone. So it was changed at some point, and it was reduced in significance, and yet it still went on. So here's a quote from 1984. This is Gordon Hinckley, 1984, talking about the importance of the temple cornerstone. Someone's asking in the comment, am I a Freemason? I am not a Freemason. So here's President Hinckley, 1984. He says, in each new temple, we have had a cornerstone ceremony in harmony with a tradition that goes back to ancient times. Before the general use of concrete, the foundation walls of the building were laid with large stones. A trench would be dug, and stones would be placed as footings. Starting at a point of beginning, the foundation wall would be run in one direction to a cornerstone. Then the corner would be turned and the wall would run to the next corner where another stone was placed, from which the wall would be run to the next corner and from there to the point of beginning. In many instances, including the construction of early temples in the church, cornerstones were used at each junction point of the walls and put in place with ceremony. The final stone was spoken of as the chief cornerstone, and its placement became the reason for much celebration. With this cornerstone in position, the foundation was ready for the superstructure. Hence the analogy that Paul used in describing the true church. This is from Ephesians 2 that Hinckley is now quoting. Now therefore ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints in the household of God, and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. He's talking about foundation. And so Paul is saying that Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto an holy temple in the Lord. So Paul is just leaning in heavily into this cornerstone symbolism. Hinckley, 2,000 years later or whatever, is talking about it. And then in his remarks, Hinckley goes on and lists what he considered the four cornerstones of the gospel. Number 1, Jesus Christ. Number 2, the first vision. Number 3, the Book of Mormon. And number 4, restoration of priesthood power and authority. So only a couple more references to share. This one is from Quentin Cook, 2016, 7 years ago. He's sharing a story about the dedication of a temple in Fiji in June 2000. So he's sharing the story a decade and a half after. He says the dedication was remarkable. As the temple neared completion, members of parliament were taken hostage by a group of rebels. Downtown Suva in Fiji was looted and burned. The military declared martial law. As the area president, I went with the 4 stake presidents in Fiji. Quentin Cook was the area president in Fiji? That's interesting. Anyways, I went with the 4 stake presidents in Fiji and met the military leaders at the Queen Elizabeth Barracks. After we explained the proposed dedication, they were supportive, but concerned about the safety of President Hinckley. They recommended a small dedication with no events outside the temple, like the cornerstone ceremony. They emphasized that anyone outside the temple could be a potential target for violence. President Hinckley approved one small dedicatory session with just the new temple presidency and a few local leaders. No others were invited because of the danger. However, this is Elder Cook sharing the story. However, President Hinckley emphatically stated, quote, "If we do dedicate the temple, we will have this cornerstone ceremony because Jesus Christ is the chief cornerstone and this is his church." Cook continues, "When we actually went outside for the cornerstone ceremony, there were no non-members, children, media, or others present, but a faithful prophet demonstrated his courageous and unwavering commitment to the Savior. Later, President Hinckley, speaking of the Savior, said, 'There is none equal to him. There never has been. There never will be. Thanks be to God for the gift of his beloved Son, who gave his life that we might live, and who is the chief immovable cornerstone of our faith and his church.'" So, very interesting, right? He's sharing this response from President Hinckley, where he says, despite security threats and despite eliminating other dedicatory sessions, and despite telling the local saints, sorry, you won't be able to participate, and everything else, taking all these precautionary measures, Hinckley says, if we do dedicate the temple, we will have the cornerstone ceremony because Jesus Christ is the chief cornerstone and this is his church. I find that very interesting, right? So separately, 1984, I read that quote from Hinckley talking about the importance of the cornerstone ceremony in the temple. Here, Elder Cook is sharing the story from President Hinckley talking about that. And now, last month, a few weeks ago, the First Presidency came out with a 28-word news release that says, in total, construction techniques have advanced to the point that cornerstones are no longer included in large buildings. Therefore, temple cornerstone ceremonies will no longer be part of temple dedications. So, construction techniques advanced to the point that cornerstones are no longer included in large buildings quite a while ago. And the church still does, groundbreaking ceremonies with their golden shovels, and they still do the dedications, right? Those things are not going away. And as I said earlier, the cornerstone ceremony had already been, despite modern construction standards, had already been modified to just be an ornamental cornerstone, more for the symbolism than the actual physical cornerstone. So we had been operating for some time already with a symbolic cornerstone using modern construction standards. One of the things that has changed is temple construction itself. So as you may have seen kind of coming out with or soon around that announcement was this this new strategy that the church has to build modular temples. So they create it in Alabama, and they basically, like Lego blocks, are now building temples in factories in Alabama, and then they ship all these pieces to the location of the temple, and then they're able to assemble them on site. They just did this for the Helena, Montana temple, and Elder Stevenson dedicated it with no cornerstone ceremony because it was just after this announcement by the church. The last temple to be dedicated with a cornerstone ceremony was just a few weeks prior. Elder Oaks dedicated the temple in Richmond, Virginia. And that one had a cornerstone ceremony, and it was just, days before this 28-word news release came out. Interestingly, at that dedication in Richmond, Virginia, Elder Oaks said, "The most important idea about a cornerstone is that Jesus Christ himself is the chief cornerstone, setting the direction for the building at the key position in the foundation. So it is with this temple." And then days later, he and his colleagues in the First Presidency said, never mind, we're dispensing with a cornerstone ceremony, even a lightly symbolic one. And, I'm sure in the modular design, they can just point to some little ornate outward exterior stone-looking fake faux, thing, and we can still just say symbolically, we'll call that a cornerstone. Just like for years, the cornerstones being put in with mortar have not been the actual cornerstone. So really, I see it as a move away from the symbolism, because we've been retaining the symbolism without the structure, without the physicality of it. We've preserved, and Hinckley was in particular very emphatic. I don't know. I see this as kind of interesting. I think of President Hinckley, right, overseeing the I'm a Mormon campaign and Mormon.org and what was the Meet the Mormons, film, and Mormon, right? And Hinckley saying, no, we own the term and we're Mormons and here's what we believe. And then Nelson comes along, President Nelson, and just 180 flips it and says, nope, that's a victory for Satan anytime you use the word Mormon. And so then here's Hinckley talking about we aren't doing temple dedications without the cornerstone ceremony. They have to be done. Jesus is the cornerstone. This reminds us of that. And then here comes President Nelson to say, no, we're nixing that too. I don't know what's going on. I find it interesting. And the cornerstone ceremony in modern times was never about construction techniques. Right? To say that the construction techniques have advanced to the point that cornerstones are no longer included in large buildings, again, that's been the case for quite some time. That's not what the cornerstone ceremony was about. It was about orienting ourselves to Jesus using this symbolism of these edifices, these structures that we're building. And so you can imagine, I'm being a bit snide here, but, imagine saying that clothing techniques or construction or clothing styles have advanced to the point where 2 layers are no longer included on most bodies. Therefore, temple garments will no longer be part of the temple ceremony. You can say, oh, things have changed in our society, therefore we're discarding these things from the past. And I want to leave some space for that being possible. Of course it can. I mean, it's all about progression, and not everything that was done in the past was true and right and good. And so it is important to move beyond things, just as it was with the law of Moses, right? So it's not like we should just cling to things from the past because they're from the past, because tradition, that's not what it's about. The traditions of the fathers, when they were wrong, were harmful. When they were good, they were great. But it's important to have that distinction. So I don't want to say that, well, just because we've always done these cornerstone ceremonies, we have to continue to do them, and abandoning them means that we're, losing our faith and the church is apostatizing or whatever. But I do think it is useful to analyze this instance about the cornerstones of the temple, the ceremonies being done away with, in reference to other rituals that we're losing. Because my perspective is, as a society, this postmodern secular society that we're really leaning into, we, members of the church, but many people beyond us, we are abandoning ritual. We are abandoning symbolism. Everything goes to literalism and secularism, and we deprive ourselves of the fraternal, ritualistic. Certainly the church members largely no longer being Masons, but even in modern times, abandoning the Kiwanis Club and Rotary Club, or, in early America, the country was littered with what were called fraternal organizations, where people united based on their heritage, what country they immigrated from, or their religion, or their community, or their common cause. And oftentimes these organizations would have, handshakes, or they'd have, not uniforms, but they'd have dress, or they'd have things to tie them together and to provide them symbols that would help them to remember who they are and what they believed and what they were focused on. And so what are some other examples? What other rituals are we losing in the church? Well, I could talk about the temple, but I'm not going to mention much. But I will mention a few things. I think we've lost actual washing and actual anointing. I think that's an issue, an example of rituals that we're losing. Moving from room to room. You know, you look at the early temples where during part of the endowment process, there was this very participatory approach where you're kind of going through the heavenly kingdoms and experiencing that. And now it's just, sit in a room, watch a movie, and we'll pretend that you're moving from kingdom to kingdom by turning some lights on. Moving away from the live endowment to video. We used to have in temples, in the early temples, you'd have assembly halls with pulpits and saints could come and receive instruction. And so the temples were much more participatory in that regard. And so, again, like with construction, if everything flows down the path of efficiency, then certainly there's a lot to ritual and symbolism that you want to trim the fat so that you can be more efficient, if that is your priority. Certainly it's far more efficient to have people watch a video that's recorded once that you can just play over and over again than it is to recruit a bunch of volunteers and train them and coach them and prepare them so that they can administer, a live endowment. It is far more efficient to do a video. It's more efficient to build buildings that don't require people to go from, 3 rooms. Just keep them in one room and, brighten the lights. So and I don't think efficiency is a problem. I think we should be efficient in what we do. I strive for efficiency in all my work. It's something I focus on heavily. But I think it's important to balance efficiency against other priorities. And if we pursue efficiency to the exclusion of the substantive symbols that can deepen someone's faith and experience and add to the richness of the gospel, then I think we have to pause and say, is efficiency the priority, or should we be seeking for deeper meaning and experience? I think prayer circles is another ritual that, they're in the temple a little bit, but there used to be more broadly prayer circles. In the early church, a lot of times the congregation would kneel while the sacrament was being blessed. So in Doctrine and Covenants 2076, it says that the priests who are blessing the sacrament should, quote, kneel with the church. This is from a scholarly journal talking about it. Talks about how it mentions it in Moroni 4 as well. And it says, it's possible that, like the manner of worship of Catholics, Joseph Smith believed that such formalism, kneeling during the sacrament, could help the saints better empathize with the Savior when in Gethsemane he knelt in atoning supplication. That's in Luke 22. And so the early saints would kneel because Moroni 4 and D&C 20 and Joseph Smith were saying, when we kneel, it's like, Jesus kneeling in the Garden of Gethsemane, or it's a sign of reverence and submission, and it's a communal thing that we all do, that the priests are kneeling with the church. In 1902, Joseph F. Smith said it was no longer necessary, and so people stopped doing that. Here's Joseph Fielding Smith, an interesting quote from him, which I think shows the importance of being careful with this stuff. He says that it became the custom in many wards throughout the church to have the young men who passed the sacrament all dressed alike with dark coats, white shirts, and uniform ties. This could, in time, lead to the established custom of dressing them in uniform, such as we see done in some sectarian and other churches. Then again, as they passed the sacrament, they had to stand with their left hand plastered on their backs in a most awkward manner. I've seen this when I was on my mission in Honduras. They were doing it all the time down there. It was really weird. The priests or elders, he continues, who administered these holy emblems had to stand in a certain way as the one officiating in the prayer knelt at the table. In some instances, the bishop stood in the pulpit with raised hands in an attitude of benediction. Sorry, I had a little alert pop up. Other customs among the quorums and in the services of the wards were introduced. Members of the church were instructed that they must not touch the trays containing the bread and the water with their left hand, but must take it in their right hand, after partaking as their neighbor held the tray in his or her right hand. He's wrapping up. In the priesthood, in the wards, we now have supervisors directing the activities of the deacons and the priests. How long will it take before these supervisors are considered a regular part of the priesthood, and it will be necessary to set them apart and ordain them to this office? I'm in the young men's, what do they call it, a specialist? So I'm not a supervisor, but, there are these positions now. He says, so we see that we, if we're not careful, will find ourselves traveling the road that brought the Church of Jesus Christ in the first centuries into disrepute and paved the way for the apostasy. So here's Joseph Fielding Smith talking about, look, this can get out of hand, right? Symbolism, like you can just create all these symbols and, we do this because it's important because of that. And, and you can go crazy with this stuff, right? And so it goes back to balance. It goes back to making sure that we're intentional in the right way. Maybe the ones that are more ancient rather than coming up with our own ones, you might say. But I think that's interesting. And also one of the problems with us kneeling for the sacrament is that in all the modern chapels, pews are built so close that it's not possible unless you kind of awkwardly turn around and then kneel in the opposite direction, kind of leaning over the seat. But our pews are not built to facilitate this. Another ritual, something that was, I don't want to say regularly practiced, but it seems to be commonly enough practiced in the early church, was that women would wash and anoint other women who were about to give birth. So there was this washing and anointing, and the president of the church at the time, I can't remember who it was, but he was asked, and he's like, look, it's not an official thing, and it's not a temple thing, and it's not a priesthood thing, but as a customary ritual to provide support and community and solidarity and all that, it's fine. And so this wasn't an official priesthood washing and anointing, but it was something in preparation for birth that women would do for one another. I think wine instead of water for sacrament, the scriptures say to do wine and we do water. I think getting back to that, D&C 89 talks about, only drinking, or maybe it's not 89, whichever section's talking about using wine for sacrament, but only wine of your own make. So, the church owns all these farms and everything, and it can easily produce its own wine for use in sacrament. Interestingly, in the early, when I say early church now, I mean in the early days of the modern church, there was a tradition that a lot of women practiced to bake bread for the sacrament. And in doing so, they would kind of be in the position, you might say, of Mary, in kind of giving birth to the body of Jesus, or Eve before her, you might say, this kind of maternal role there to create the body of Jesus that will be sacrificed. So here's a couple quotes I found that I thought were really interesting. Charity Savage baked sacrament bread in Henryville, Utah during the 1890s. Her daughter remembered, quote, "At that time, the bishopric took turns in furnishing the sacrament. When it was Father's turn, Mother had her own way in preparing it. She cut the crusts off the loaves of bread, then sliced it into half-inch strips. Preparing it this way made it easier for the priests to break it evenly. She had crystal plates she kept for the sacrament only. She would put the bread on the plates, cover it with a pretty white linen towel that she kept especially for that purpose. Father was always so proud to take it to church." Now you just get a loaf of Wonder Bread, right? And you hope that the person assigned to bring it brings it, and there's no symbolism in it. It's just the bread. It's just the factory produced, store-bought, bread. Here's another example. Ruth Waddell recalled, "The women in the ward took turns providing the bread for the sacrament. Mom would take special care when it was her turn. She made sure the final product was white in color and that the texture was even. She cut off the crusts so it would look beautiful in the tray. Mom always made good bread, but for the sacrament, it had to be just right." Such accounts of special plates, cloths, and attention to details of texture and preparation. This is an analysis or article I found talking about. This is in the Juvenile Instructor. Such accounts of special plates, cloths, and attention to details of texture and preparation all underscore the defining influence of routinized activity, the significance of human making and doing, the tendency of women to create rituals from domestic work, and how these innovations went on to impact the larger ritual, the sacrament. The inventive nature of these unofficial, parallel rituals underscores the idea that belief is more than a linguistic act, words. Baking sacrament bread was a material form of religious worship that connected women to the Lord's Supper and provided a medium for women to create their own individualized rituals. It made the domestic work of women visible in public worship spaces in a way that didn't challenge gendered ideas. It set their domestic labor on display under the umbrella of a priesthood ordinance. So I thought that was fascinating. I think that's great. I think that's an amazing kind of ritual and something more participatory, because that's the point of ritual. It's not just random casual observance, superficial, whatever. It's participatory. That's why in the temple with the reduced, modified rituals that we still have, it's participatory, right? You can't just sit there and watch a video the whole time. There has to be this participatory process to remind you. This is why the Lord gave the obstinate Jews the law of Moses with all of its rituals, for the sole and specific purpose of helping them better come to know Jesus, helping them better understand God. Of course, they went off the path and turned it in all kinds of garbage. But the point of these rituals was to point them to God. And it's no different today. And look, I'll be frank, I am not the most hippy dippy ritual kind of guy, I recognize the importance of what I'm saying here, but I'm not one to go join some fraternal society and do all these, ritualistic things. I remember distinctly when I was in Boy Scouts, my dad was a scoutmaster. And so I got my Eagle Scout, and I got, what do they call it? Order of the Arrow. And they had this initiation process. It was at night. We were in a big circle around a campfire. There were, as I recall, there were adults in, what would you call them? Not headdresses, but almost like the Egyptian god hats, where they would look like a jackal or look like a, whatever, right? And they had these costumes on to make them look like these animals, I think. And they would come around and they would whisper in my ear a passphrase, a secret passphrase that I would be required to then later repeat to whatever the person's title was, to gain passage and be admitted. And so it was this very kind of fraternal ritual designed to convey the important. Now as a 16-year-old kid or whatever, I thought the whole thing was strange, and I didn't understand the importance. And I got plenty of problems with Boy Scouts. Maybe I'll do a musing on that someday. There's actually some really good things that I'm frustrated about the church leaving the Boy Scouts for, because the new program is, shall we say, substandard in compared to all the ways that Boy Scouts was helping boys become men and so forth. Anyways, so I've got my issue with the Boy Scouts, but you can see the importance of symbolism and ritual to convey the importance and the kind of exclusivity or the intentionality of what you're doing, and give your mind, we're storytelling creatures. So if I just sit down and read to you some kind of thing, some initiation ritual, whatever, you're going to forget it. Right? When I blessed my babies, my kids, when they were babies, I don't remember the words that were said. Now we violated the handbook by recording what was said. You're apparently not supposed to, and we did it anyway so that we could then transcribe, and we've got a document with the words from the baby blessing. But I don't remember any of the words I said. I do remember the feeling. I do remember what it was like having my dad and my father-in-law and my grandpa, right? I do remember what it was like having family there in this participatory experience, this ritual of blessing our baby. By the way, if you don't know this already, bless your baby at home. Fully allowed under the handbook, but I don't think a lot of people maybe know about that. We always do this Lion King, ritual, hold the baby up and in sacrament, but it's way more intimate to do it at home. We did both of ours at home, and it was awesome because it's just with the people that you care about. It's this kind of sacred space, very intimate. And so that ritual has meaning for me. That was kind of like storytelling. It's more substantive and sticking in our brains than if I just sat there and read from a paper and read this, blessing. So too, I think, with ritual. And a lot of the symbolism in the church, right? The symbols can convey meaning. They can create participatory experience. Think of another ritual that we've abandoned is building churches. I remember my mom, when I was young, telling me the story in Michigan, how they had to do a fundraiser for the chapel. And the members would all help build. I mean, certainly in the early days of the modern church, all the saints would participate in building the temple and they would tithe their money. A lot of times, it's because they were poor. And so now we've moved into a society where we've outsourced everything. It's corporate instead of communal. Like, think of the Amish doing a barn raising, right? And in a day, constructing this building through the collaborative efforts of people who are being more closely knit together in a community. Like, hey, we did that together. We have this common experience. And we don't have that at all. We have no sense of pride and ownership in our church. When you're assigned to go clean the church, it's drudgery. I don't want to go. Like, we have no pride of ownership. And I think earlier on the saints did, because that was their building. Their sacrifice made it real. And we moved away from that, the ritualistic approach towards just building the very edifices. Now you might say, well, liability concerns and modern construction methods and blah, 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 blah. But I'm sure there are other ways to involve the saints and create these participatory experiences rather than outsourcing things, streamlining things, and making it all efficient. And doing a prefab modular temple somewhere else that you just ship, build, boom, it's there. So again, I don't think that's inherently bad. I don't think it's inherently a problem. But I do think all of this is reflective of a broader decline in our society in participation in these fraternal societies and ritual processes and these symbols. And I don't know what the future holds if we abandon the symbols and the rituals that knit us together as a community. We're not a community. I mean, maybe your ward is different and you're an exception, but I would argue that in most, and maybe, Utah's weird and I've been here for 20 something years now, but I'm thinking back to my whole experience growing up in California. It's like, are we truly a community? Or is it just on, Sunday nights or Sundays and Wednesday nights when we have activities or whatever, right? Like the bonding and the mutual support that comes from these participatory experiences is quite different. It's like, when you do a prayer circle, you feel differently about the people that you're in that prayer circle with. And so yeah, I think we are now an atomized society. The nuclear family is weak. The social fabric is all but destroyed. We don't really have what Alexis de Tocqueville called the mediating institutions in our society, basically the fraternal organizations and civic groups and the Rotaries and the Kiwanis and the Masons and all these things that are on the decline. Everywhere you look, they're on the decline. Churches are on the decline. People in our society no longer really want or crave or see the importance in these kind of formalistic, ritualistic, symbolic type of things. It's all literalism. And I'm a pretty literal guy, so I get, and I'm probably a product of my time too, so I have that going on, but I get it. I don't want to be kind of the weird hippy-dippy, let's dress up funny and say weird things or whatever, but there is room for symbolism, and it is important, and I think that we've been going in a direction in our church of moving away heavily from it in the name of efficiency, and I muse today, and I wonder about if that's troublesome or if it portends some future challenge we're going to face because we are increasingly abandoning the symbols that can knit us together and remind us of the meat of the gospel and remind us more clearly of Jesus Christ. I don't know, something to consider. Yeah, we'll end there. I gotta go catch a plane. Hope you all have an awesome week. See you next Sunday.